Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with our last video for the Machine Quilting Block Party. Today we're going to quilt our basic Dresden plate with many beautiful designs. Just like all of the blocks from this year, we're going to quilt it with some feathers, some ruler foot quilting, some simple spirals, and little rainbows in the borders. So let's get started learning how to quilt this step by step together. So I'm getting started quilting block 12 in the center, and I have already stitched this block in the ditch around the petals and between the inside of the block and the border. So I've stitched along those lines just to prep it up and get my pens out. And then now I have a choice of how to quilt that center circle. So there's a circle that is a 1/4 inch away from the outer edge of the circle applique. And I have templates number 10 and number 8, and I could use either one of these with ruler foot quilting. Now please understand the ruler foot quilting here is completely optional. If you don't have a ruler foot or the rulers, that's okay. You can always use a walking foot or regular free motion quilting. But if you're going to use this, I want you to understand that you have a choice here. You can quilt with the smaller circle, and you're going to be holding that circle and then just kind of spinning around it like that. You could also use the larger circle, center it up, and be able to grip it and stitch around it just like that. Now the one downside of using the bigger circle is that it gets stuck. It'll get locked in by your foot, and we're going to be filling this applique with pebbling. So that annoys me. I'll be completely honest. I don't like having any kind of hoop or anything around my foot. It really I find it really distracting. So I'm going to use the smaller circle. That's template number 8. And one thing I did was I centered this up right in the middle of that circle applique and drew a line all the way around it. And what that did was it allowed me to know exactly where that center is and where that template needs to stay in position. So that way, as I quilt around it, I know I can keep it in position and it won't slip. So we're ready to go. I've got my ruler foot in place, and just a little reminder, make sure to always, whenever you're working with a ruler foot on your machine, drop the needle down with the foot in the down position. If I had it up, the needle bar here on the foot, on the machine, would have crashed into the top of that foot. So I'm going to slide the block away, take that top thread, give it a tug. That loop that comes up is the bobbin thread. So now I'm going to take both thread tails, hold them together, and drop my needle back down exactly in that position. There we go. Everything's solid. We're on the right foot. Okay, so now I'm going to begin stitching really slowly. And what I'm doing here is gripping the ruler. I'm pressing that firmly down, and I'm also pressing against the edge of that ruler foot. I want to make sure that the ruler doesn't slip. I also want to make sure that the ruler foot doesn't veer away, because I could wiggle off and go do any free motion quilting design I wanted to. This is a free motion quilting foot, but I want to keep it nicely controlled. I want to stitch a nice smooth circle. Now pay attention to how I'm spinning the block with my hands. I'm quilting in a clockwise direction. Place one hand kind of flat here, and I'm using that to rotate the entire block through the machine. And I do that because it just helps me stay exactly against that ruler and helps me form this nice smooth circle shape, nice and even. And it's just slow and careful stitching. And yes, I do think that it's important to continue to rotate. That's what feels most natural to me. If that doesn't feel natural to you and you want to instead kind of hold the ruler in place and move the block, or kind of shift it in a different way, play around with it. Just see what feels most natural to you. You might want to play on a practice sandwich instead of your real block, just simply so you don't accidentally mess it up. Experimentation really needs to happen on a practice sandwich. It always works out better that way. There we go. So we have that entire circle stitched. And I have to say, that is far more perfect than I could have stitched it without the ruler. So I'm really happy with that. Now we're going to fill in this circle with some pebbling. And this is circular shapes, nice big circles here. So sometimes I'm going to cut a circle in half just to make kind of a nice variety of designs and shapes. I don't want all of the circles to be the exact same size. That could get kind of boring. So instead I'm going to mix it up. Some are going to be really big, some are going to be small, some I'm going to cut in half or in quarter, or just stitch a little sliver of it. I do want to generally make some nice big circles. So swinging out and around to form a nice big circle every once in a while is really important. And that's just going to make sure that the block stays nice and soft, doesn't get too stiff. And do keep in mind, you can mark all of these designs from the pattern. The full-size quilting diagram is included in your pattern, so you can always mark it. You don't have to do this freehand. Freehand means without marks, and I'm so basically stitching this from memory, from memorizing it. And please understand, this is just one method, one way of quilting. It's not the only way. So now I'm going to swing around again, form another circle shape. Now what happens if you stitch off? Like let's say you make a mistake and it's kind of messy and you don't really want to have to rip it out. Like there I did a bad travel stitch, it wasn't really exactly perfect. Well, what I do is I just go back over it a few times. So I'm going to stitch back over that area just a few times, kind of throw more thread at it. Why should I pick up a seam ripper and go and rip that out when ripping is not going to get me any better at quilting? Ripping is only going to make me frustrated and slow me down. So instead, I'm just going to keep on stitching and stitch back over that area a few times. Another thing that can help, and this adds a lot of drama to your quilts, and that is to fill in all those little gaps around your circles. It's kind of thread painting almost. Here, I'll show you right in this spot. I'm just going to go back and forth, back and forth. This is a design I call hairball filler when you start spinning in really tight circles. And you can see it because I'm using white thread, it basically covers the fabric with that white thread and really makes those circles pop. And no one would know that you're using it to cover up a mistake. So, it looks really impressive. Like, oh my gosh, she has such good control over her stitches in her free motion quilting. And then, you don't tell them that, hey, that was hiding a travel stitching mistake. You never tell people that, you're basically just decorating your mistakes and making them actually stand out a little bit better. That's okay. Just never tell anybody. So often we're showing off a quilt and like, oh, well, here's all the mistakes, and we point to all of them, and that's so silly. Don't do that. Instead, just bask in the praise. That's much better. So you can see I'm just filling in lots more circle shapes as I work through this area. I'm going to continue quilting, pebbling, and because I already started filling in the background and quilting densely in those areas, I think I'm going to continue that as well. And here's what it looks like whenever I finish the center circle. So now I'm quilting the Dresden plate petals, and I've got this nice small feather shape. So I'm going to start by stitching the stem and then just travel stitch all the way back to the starting point. And now I'm going to branch out and fill all of the feathers along one side. Now, if this feather looks similar to other feathers, well, it probably is. One of the things about a sampler quilt is adding elements, of taking elements from one block and using them in another block, so that way, even though the blocks are very different, the sampler kind of gets pulled together by similar quilting designs. So these two petal designs were actually used in block number 1. This exact same feather shape and the spiral we're going to stitch too. And this helps tie block number 1 and block number 12 together. So this is a very simple feather. All I'm doing is stitching back along the back edge of that feather, just careful travel stitching, branch out and around, and then hit back with that stem. And it's a repetitive set of movements. I just travel back, form the next feather. In this case, I'm bouncing along the tip of that stem. Now I'm going to go around the teardrop shape at the end of the feather. Now, as we hit that teardrop shape, that's where the feathers start to turn in the opposite direction. And so basically now we're going from top to bottom, and this is going to feel different. It's going to be the opposite basically opposite set of steps, then we work quilting on the opposite side. And this feels a little bit more awkward to me, but that might be different for you, so just definitely pay attention to it and think about it as you're quilting, what feels good, what feels natural to you. And as you can see, I slow down just a little bit as I'm forming these feathers. I just have to think about it just a little bit more. And it's one of those things, everybody is going to quilt feathers differently, so I encourage you to take this design and experiment with it. Practice on a practice sandwich a few times and see which is the best way for you to quilt it. So now I'm finishing up with these last few small feather shapes. And then now I'm going to travel stitch around the outside of the circle to reach the spiral design. So notice how slowly I'm stitching here. I don't want to get messy. I don't want to accidentally stitch into the purple applique. That would look messy, and I really don't want to stitch off and get into the blue or in the green. I'll just stay right along the edge of that circle shape. So now I have this open spiral, and I'm just going to quilt into it along that line, swirl inside, and then quilt back out again. And this is what I love about spirals like this. They're very quick and simple to stitch, really take no time at all, and they fill in with a really nice simple texture. And if you're wondering, yes, you can absolutely add extra designs within these petal shapes. I wanted to keep them a little bit more simple, a little bit more open, and that's why I allowed myself to go kind of thread crazy over here with the pebbling. You know, it's one of those things, I think one area of density and intensity kind of balances out if you leave a little bit more space open in the petals. And that also allows you to really focus in on these designs and be able to appreciate them. So the next step is to switch back to ruler foot quilting and quilt some straight lines in our background. So I'll meet you back here when we're ready to do that next. So now I'm quilting in the background, and this is a space that we're going to fill in with evenly spaced lines. And this is a little unusual because we're stitching squares. I'm going to quilt it from the border to the inside. So the very first step is to line up your ruler, and I'm using template number 3 from the Dresden plate template set. I'm lining the edge of the ruler up with this ditch, this seam line between the center of the block and the border. And I'm pressing firmly down, and I'm also pressing against the ruler foot. So that way it's not sliding out of the way. That way I'm keeping everything in nice alignment, and that is going to keep that straight line nice and straight. Now as I stitch down, I want to visualize and keep my eye on the edges of the foot. I don't want to be looking at the needle because it's really easy if I focus on the needle to overshoot. As I come down to this corner, I want to get to a point where the edges of the foot are hitting both seam lines. So a few more stitches here, and right there. So now the edge here and the edge on the side are both hitting the seam line. That tells me it's time to pivot the whole block, turn it around, line up my ruler along this seam line, and keep on stitching. So this innermost line is a solid full square, so I'm going to get to my starting point and break thread and move to the next line. Now it's very careful stitching, but you know, this is actually much faster than if I was quilting this in regular free motion or with my walking foot. That's not to say that you couldn't use either of those forms of machine quilting. Please understand that ruler foot quilting is, you know, it's just another tool in your toolbox, but it's not like the only option that you could use to stitch these straight lines. So now I'm nearing my starting point. I'm going to stitch right up to it. I'm going to break thread right here and then move on to our next line, which is a 1/2 inch away. So I've pulled up thread on my next line of quilting, which is a 1/2 inch away from the first line of quilting. So lining up my ruler here, I can line up the second line from the edge with the ditch, and I can also line up the first line from the edge with the previously stitched line of quilting. So it's kind of cool. You can line up both things and see just how accurately both were stitched. And that also stops the ruler from, you know, getting slightly off and stitching at a slightly weird angle. So it's the exact same set of steps. I'm sliding the ruler down, getting it in position, gripping firmly, then slow stitching, And I did mark a few of these lines. Just kind of having a guideline of where that corner turns is a good thing to have. Unfortunately, I realized halfway through marking that actually my marks were not nearly as accurate as my rulers would be, which is why I erased most of my marks. The spacing on the ruler and having, you know, those lines right there, right on top of your seam line and keeping it tight to the foot, that is far more accurate than a marked line, even using a light box. You know, I think the only thing more accurate would be marking the shape with a ruler and spacing it out just exactly right, but even that could get off. So it's one of those things. It's really fascinating. The more I get into ruler foot quilting, the more I realize that it really makes things not only faster, but it also makes it even more accurate. So I'm coming up on where I think I should turn that edge, turn that corner. You know, if I'm off ever so slightly, I can always use the hand wheel, just rotate towards me to lift the needle and drop it down exactly where it needs to go. There we go. Now you might be wondering why I keep rotating the block. I could, of course, stitch this like this, but that would feel kind of awkward because it would be shoving the quilt into the arm of the machine in a really awkward angle. So I just keep going in a way that feels most natural to me. And that is to feed the quilt into the machine kind of the way it's meant to go, which is straight forward and back, you know. I always, as you have noticed probably in this entire video, I always lean towards what feels the easiest. That makes the most sense to me. And, you know, I can't imagine why I would pick to quilt, why I would choose to quilt in a direction that doesn't feel natural and doesn't feel easier. So here I'm hand rotating that needle, just using the hand wheel to get it exactly in position, making sure those lines are lined up nicely, and stitch on down. The nice thing is it only takes a second to double check those corners, and once you get it right, it's really no big deal. Now it is kind of interesting, I am noticing as I stitch this that my petals of my Dresden plate aren't nearly as accurate as I thought they were. Some of these petals are getting really close to the needle and some of them are not. So that's interesting too. The accuracy of this form of quilting can also, I don't know, kind of shine a light on slightly inaccurate piecing. So I have to keep an eye on that. This was, of course, appliqued, so those petals are probably not going to be exactly the same size and shape or exactly perfect, and that's okay too. So now I'm coming back around on my starting line. I want to make sure to hit the exact same point, and the nice thing is I'm so close to the end of that petal that I'm going to be able to travel stitch. So what I'm going to do here is slide the ruler away so I kind of get in my head that I'm not ruler foot quilting right now. I'm going to travel stitch along the outline of that petal shape. Slow and careful stitching, and I want to be exactly 1/4 of an inch away from the line we just stitched. So that means I want the edge of that foot to be in line with that line of quilting, and that looks good. I'm going to line up my ruler foot, my ruler right now with that previously stitched line, so the edge is right on top of that previously stitched line. And stitch on down. That looks great. Now I'm going to go back to travel stitching along that edge. This is really just, you know, kind of a form of stitching in the ditch. I've already stitched this before I began quilting the block. I went on ahead and stitched around the petal shapes. So really I'm just travel stitching on top of a previous line of stitching. Slow and careful, that's the key. So now I'm going to stitch down 1/4 of an inch away from my previous line of stitching. I'm stitching down until both edges of the ruler foot are kind of nested in that corner. Then I'll rotate and stitch the next line. Now I've got several more lines within this corner, so I'm going to travel stitch back, and I want to space this 1/2 of an inch apart. So I'm going to travel stitch up and around that petal, and I'm kind of eyeballing it. You know, when it looks like I'm about 1/4 of an inch away from that line of quilting, just put your ruler on it and see where you're at. And if it's close enough, it's close enough. And again, make sure that you're not overshooting it as you come in and stitch to that corner. I'm going to rotate and hand guide that stitch so I'm exactly in the right position. Because this is a pattern, we have a set of closer spaced lines, I call them pinstripes. So lines that are 1/4 of an inch away, and then we have lines that are 1/2 of an inch away. And this creates a really elegant texture for your quilts. It's beautiful. It does take just a little bit more time, just a little bit more focus and attention to space those lines evenly and make sure that they maintain that nice spacing. So you just have to kind of keep it in your head, keep your diagram of the block quilting design near you, so that way you keep that in your mind, and work slowly and carefully. As you can see, I just travel stitch in. I'm eyeballing about 1/4 of an inch away from that previous line of stitching. I've put my ruler on it to see if we're in the right place, and I think we are. Stitch up a bit. That's the hardest part, stitching kind of backwards and then not being able to see where to stop. That's the part where I just overshot my line a little bit. Not going to rip it out. I'm just 1 stitch over, no big deal. Just going to leave it. Keep on going. Got just a very short little square shape right here, and that is that entire space quilted. So from here, I'm going to travel stitch around the outside of this petal shape and continue filling this exact same way. It's not challenging, just take your time. Keep your ruler nearby, but whenever you're travel stitching, I like to move it away from my hand so that way I just remember that I'm travel stitching and I need to focus on that. Slow and careful stitching as you work your way around the block and continue quilting all of those straight lines in the background. The last step of this block is to quilt the border, and we're going to fill this in with Echo Shell. So get started with the outer circle shape. This is just a 1/2 circle shape. Then you're going to travel stitch inside, and we're going to do an internal echo about 1/4 of an inch away. Slow, careful stitching. Try not to stop right in the middle of the circle, or kind of, what I mean is make a nice smooth arc. So all in one pass, go all the way through. When you stop and take your hands off of it and wiggle it around, it can be hard to get started again without wobbling a little bit and having kind of a noticeable blip in your line of stitching. You want those to be nice smooth arcs. So now I'm going to travel stitch all the way down and fill in our circle spiral. So this is stitched just by swinging around for that circle shape, and I really like to make these stand out nicely, so I go on ahead and swing around it a second time. And this is just careful travel stitching, slow and steady. If you stitch off the line a little bit, do what we did with the pebbling and go back over it, throw a little bit more thread at it, and travel stitch back over it a few times, and that's going to hide the mistake. So now I'm going to fill in the spiral in the corner. Stitch all the way inside. This is a closed spiral, so we're going to fill up the space completely with that line of stitching. We reach the center and then travel stitch all the way back out again. Again, slow and careful stitching. If you stitch off, just throw more thread at it. Stitch back over it again. No big deal. And that's looking good. So from here, I'm just going to continue forming more echo shell shapes, carefully quilting this design all the way around. And here's what it looks like whenever you finish our basic Dresden plate. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed learning how to piece and quilt this basic Dresden plate with me. If you're looking for the quilt pattern, you can check it out at leahday.com/blockparty. This is the last block for the Flower Festival quilt. We've learned so much about piecing and machine quilting this year. And up next, we need to learn how to connect our blocks together to create our finished Flower Festival quilt. So make sure to check out the tutorials and videos coming out soon. Of course, if you liked this video, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel on YouTube so you don't miss the next video coming out soon. Until next time, let's go quilt.